He ascended the throne before he even knew what power meant, and he died before reaching manhood. Emperor Shang of Han, a boy monarch at just 17, was never a ruler, only a pawn. Behind silk curtains and gilded halls, the Empress Dowager's clan pulled the strings. And when he no longer served their purpose, poison silenced him forever, leaving a haunting reminder of how fragile an emperor's crown could be. In the year 105 CE, within the confines of the Eastern Han dynasty's palatial walls, a child was born into a fate that he neither chose nor could escape. His name was Liu Long, later known to history as Emperor Shang of Han. He was the grandson of Emperor Zhang, and by blood alone he belonged to a family in which every smile was a mask and every whisper could carry the weight of conspiracy. The boy's childhood was not one of carefree laughter or childish games, but of shadows and rigid ceremony. From the moment he could recognize faces, he was surrounded not by friends or siblings, but by eunuchs, attendants, and watchful courtiers. They measured his every glance, every step, as if each action of the young prince was already a matter of state. The palace, with its towering walls and gilded halls, seemed less like a home and more like a gilded cage, polished to shine but never to set him free. Unlike other children, Liu Long could not run through open fields or chase after dragonflies in the garden. His companions were texts he could not yet read, rituals he could not yet understand, and eyes that judged his worth not as a child, but as a political symbol. The innocence of youth was stripped away in the name of destiny. Inside the imperial palace, love was never simple. His family bonds were tangled with power struggles, and affection was often measured against political utility. To be a prince was to live in a constant rehearsal for a role one could never decline. He was the promise of continuity, the fragile thread upon which the dynasty's legitimacy hung. Yet, in that role, he had no voice of his own. The court was not a place where a child could belong. It was a theater where actors performed with ruthless precision. Liu Long was thrust onto that stage before he could even understand what it meant. And already the forces that would one day consume him were waiting in the wings. The factions within the Han court, particularly the powerful clan of the Empress Dowager, saw in him not a boy, but an opportunity, an empty vessel through which they could extend their control. In that atmosphere of suspicion and cold ambition, the boy grew. He learned silence before he learned speech. He learned obedience before he understood choice. And long before he came of age, he learned that his life was never his own. The palace raised him, but it never loved him. Thus, the story of Emperor Shang does not begin with a child's laughter, but with a child's loss. A loss of freedom, a loss of innocence, and eventually, a loss of life itself. In 106 CE, fate moved with a swiftness that no child could comprehend. Emperor An of Han died without a son to succeed him, and the court turned to a fragile solution. They placed the one-year-old Liu Long on the throne. A toddler who could barely walk, who could not form sentences, was now proclaimed the Son of Heaven. The empire, vast and ancient, bowed to a child who still clung to the hands of his nurses. The proclamation was meant to reassure the people, to suggest continuity in a time of uncertainty. But within the palace, everyone knew the truth. It was not Liu Long who ruled, nor could it ever be. His very youth guaranteed that others would govern in his name. The Empress Dowager Deng, widow of Emperor He and matriarch of the Deng clan, stepped forward to take the reins of power as regent. What the people saw as a child emperor was in fact a facade, a mask behind which the true players of politics concealed their moves. For the young emperor, the throne was not a gift, but a burden. The dragon throne was carved from lacquered wood and adorned with gold. But for Liu Long, it was as heavy as stone. Every decree that passed under his name was written by another's hand. Every decision attributed to him was whispered into being by those who held him as their puppet. Imagine the irony. The empire stretched across thousands of miles, yet its supreme ruler sat in swaddling clothes. Foreign envoys arrived at court, bowing deeply, only to find that the Son of Heaven was a child who could not speak to them. Ministers and generals knelt, not in loyalty to the boy, but in calculation of how best to position themselves under the dominance of the Deng family. The palace was filled with pageantry to cover the fragility of this arrangement. Grand ceremonies were staged to display imperial authority. Yet everyone present knew that authority resided elsewhere. The regent and her clan determined the empire's policies, its appointments, its future. Liu Long, Emperor Shang, was reduced to an ornament, a seal of legitimacy rather than a wielder of power. For him, the throne was not a dream fulfilled, but a cage gilded with expectations. He had no memory of a life before the crown, yet every day of his existence was dictated by forces far beyond him. From infancy, he was a symbol first and a person second. And the tragedy was clear. The higher the throne elevated him in the eyes of the empire, the more powerless he became within it. Thus, before he could even understand the meaning of sovereignty, Emperor Shang had already become its victim. His reign was not his own. It was a script written by others, performed through him, and destined to end in silence. Though the empire proclaimed Liu Long as Emperor Shang of Han, the truth was unspoken yet undeniable. Power lay not in his hands, but in those of the Empress Dowager Deng and her family. At only 1 year old, he could not rule, and so others ruled in his stead. His throne became a mask for the ambitions of another bloodline. The Empress Dowager, Deng Sui, was a woman of remarkable intelligence and ability. History remembers her as capable and diligent, a stabilizing figure in turbulent times. Yet her regency was not merely the stewardship of an orphan dynasty. It was also the consolidation of power by the Deng clan, brothers, nephews, cousins. Her entire family prospered in the shadow of her authority. They filled the offices of government, commanded the armies, and controlled the treasury. Within the palace, courtiers whispered about who truly wielded the dragon's seal. The boy who bore the title of Son of Heaven could not even speak for himself, but decrees were issued daily in his name. Edicts bore the imperial mark, yet their words were written by the regent's scribes. Appointments, promotions, punishments, all decided by the Deng family, all hidden behind the pretense of imperial legitimacy. It was a delicate balance. The empire could not admit openly that the emperor was powerless, for the very concept of heaven's mandate required that authority reside in him. But everyone at court knew the truth. The ministers bowed to a child, but listened to the Empress Dowager. The generals saluted the imperial banner, but obeyed the Deng clan. For Emperor Shang, even as he grew from infant to boy, the world was arranged for him. He learned to bow where he was told to bow, to smile when prompted, to sit upon the throne in silence while others spoke in his stead. The rituals of rulership were drilled into him, but they were hollow gestures, a play performed for the benefit of the watching court. The irony was crushing. As emperor, he was supposed to embody absolute power, yet in reality, he embodied absolute dependency. He was a vessel filled with the will of others, an emblem used to stabilize the dynasty while true authority flowed elsewhere. Even in his earliest memories, he could sense it. the weight of eyes upon him, the realization that his life was not his own. The Regency, though efficient, carved away at his identity. The Deng clan tightened their grip so fully that there was no air left for him to breathe. By the time he was old enough to understand the trappings of his position, he had already been molded into silence. His empire was vast, but his voice carried no farther than the palace walls. Thus, the story of Emperor Shang's reign is not one of command or sovereignty, but of absence. The throne was occupied, but the emperor was not truly present. The regent spoke, and the empire obeyed. He remained a boy, hidden behind curtains, paraded in ceremonies, a phantom monarch who bore the title but never the power. For most children, the years of youth are filled with play, laughter, and the discovery of the self. For Emperor Shang, those years were stolen before they could even begin. His childhood unfolded not in gardens or open courtyards, but in the suffocating silence of the palace. The imperial residence, with its towering gates and endless corridors, was less a home than a prison. Guards stood watch at every entrance. Eunuchs hovered over his every movement. Even his nurses and tutors were chosen not for their affection, but for their loyalty to the regent. Every word spoken in his presence was weighed, measured, and adjusted for political safety. A boy's life became a matter of state. He saw other children only from afar. Sons of noble families were brought to the palace occasionally, yet they were taught to treat him not as a playmate, but as a sovereign. They bowed before him, recited memorized phrases of loyalty, and then departed. Their gestures reminded him that he was different, isolated by the throne he never asked for. While other boys learned to run free, Shang learned restraint. He was taught how to sit perfectly still for hours, how to hold his expression without betraying thought, how to recite phrases that he did not understand. In every lesson, the same truth echoed. His body belonged to the empire. His will belonged to others. The palace walls closed in around him. Its courtyards, though grand, were empty of joy. Its halls echoed with footsteps, but never with laughter. He lived surrounded by splendor, yet starved of love. Even the smallest gestures of kindness were colored by political intent. Did his attendants smile because they cared for him, or because he was the emperor? Did they whisper in worry for his health, or in calculation for their own gain? As he grew older, the gap between his title and his reality became impossible to ignore. The rituals of the throne demanded obedience from millions, yet he himself was expected to obey without question. His name commanded armies, yet he could not command the course of his own life. The contradiction weighed on him, pressing down like the ornate crown that was placed upon his head during ceremonies, heavy, glittering, and unbearably cold. Childhood, once lost, cannot be regained. For Shang, it was never even offered. His identity was consumed by the role of emperor, a role he could not escape. By the time he was a teenager, he was already hollowed by the realization that his existence served others' purposes, not his own. The tragedy deepened with each passing year. The more he grew, the more dangerous he became. Not because of his actions, but because of his potential. A child could be controlled, but a young man might someday demand his voice. And so, the forces that had raised him in silence began to see him not as a symbol of stability, but as a threat. In the palace, where time was marked by ritual and ceremony, Shang's youth slipped away unnoticed. He aged in years, but not in freedom. His childhood was not his own. It was stolen, reshaped, and silenced by the machinery of power. And in that theft lay the seeds of his downfall. By the time Emperor Shang grew into adolescence, The shadow of the Deng clan stretched across every corner of the empire. What had once been a regency, meant to preserve the dynasty, had hardened into a dynasty within the dynasty. The name of the emperor still adorned every decree, but behind each brushstroke lay the will of the Deng family. They controlled the court with invisible strings. The army's generals owed their positions not to the throne, but to the patronage of Deng relatives. Governors in the provinces were selected from men loyal to the clan. Even the treasury was not truly the emperor's, for its flow was directed by the regent's hand. The empire had not only accepted the arrangement, it had come to depend on it. To the public, the fiction remained intact. The emperor was the son of heaven, the axis around which the world revolved. But in the marble corridors of the palace, the truth was undeniable. Liu Long was no longer a child who did not understand his position. He was a young man who understood too well. He recognized the hollowness of ceremonies in which he played the central role, yet carried no authority. He could feel the weight of the Deng clan pressing against him. Their presence was everywhere. The attendants who dressed him each morning were chosen by them. The tutors who guided his lessons were appointed by them. The guards who protected him, the ministers who advised him, even the cooks who prepared his meals. Every figure in his daily life was tethered to the same power. He was emperor only in name. In truth, he was a prisoner in golden chains. Whispers began to circulate in the palace corridors. What if one day this boy decided he would no longer be silent? What if he grew into his role and challenged the authority that suffocated him? The Deng clan did not need to hear him speak those words aloud. His very existence, as the legitimate emperor, was a threat to the power they had claimed. For Shang, this awareness was like a cold wind that never ceased. The higher he grew in stature, the more precarious his position became. His throne, meant to be the seat of power, felt instead like a platform built over a void. Beneath him waited the abyss of irrelevance, or worse, the abyss of elimination. The Deng clan's domination was not only political, it was psychological. It shaped the way the young emperor saw himself. Every attempt at asserting independence was quietly smothered. Every desire for agency was checked by stern reminders of obedience. The message was clear. He was not to think of himself as a ruler, but as a symbol. And symbols, when they grow inconvenient, are easily replaced. Thus, Emperor Shang's youth was lived in perpetual tension, elevated by title, diminished by reality, honored in form, ignored in substance. He sat at the center of the empire, yet he was its most powerless subject. The shadow of the Deng clan loomed so vast that even the Son of Heaven could not escape it. As Shang entered his teenage years, the palace began to notice subtle shifts in his demeanor. He was no longer the pliant child who accepted silence as his fate. Though he spoke little, his eyes carried a weight that unsettled those who observed him. Within that gaze lay unspoken questions, and perhaps the first stirrings of resistance. The emperor had grown tall enough to look ministers in the eye. He listened more attentively during court sessions, even if he was rarely allowed to speak. He studied the histories of past emperors, stories of rulers who had either grasped power with iron will or been crushed beneath the ambitions of others. He saw himself reflected in the latter, and the realization gnawed at him. The rituals of power, once empty motions, began to feel suffocating. To sit on the throne while another voice declared imperial decrees was no longer tolerable. It was humiliating. He recognized that the courtiers' bows were not to him, but to the Deng clan. Their loyalty was a performance, their reverence hollow. And beneath the surface of their submission lay calculation, as each man weighed the balance between emperor and regent. Shang's unease grew as he sensed the fragility of his own existence. His meals, once accepted without thought, now came with a shadow of fear. His attendants, once ignored, now seemed like eyes and ears reporting his every move. The walls of the palace closed in tighter, not with the innocence of childhood ignorance, but with the clarity of dawning awareness. In the chronicles of history, it is written that the emperor's health was frail. But illness in the palace was never a simple matter of the body. Each cough, each pallor, could be interpreted as a sign, an omen for the court, or an opportunity for his enemies. Whispers spread that Shang might not live long. To some, those words carried sorrow. To others, they carried possibility. The boy began to sense that his life was a thread easily cut. Every day was lived under surveillance. Every word weighed for danger. Even silence was not safe, for silence could be interpreted as dissent. He was a bird in a gilded cage, growing larger, stronger, but never freer. The more he pressed against the bars, the more he felt the sharpness of their edges. The palace's atmosphere turned colder. Ministers avoided meeting his gaze. Eunuchs bowed lower, but spoke more cautiously. The Empress Dowager, once maternal in appearance, now regarded him with a distance that he could not mistake. It was the look of one who measures not the life of a boy, but the utility of an emperor. For Shang, adolescence was not a time of discovery, but of dread. He saw clearly what had been hidden in childhood, that his destiny was not his to shape, and that his very survival depended on whether others still found him useful. The crown on his head, once a burden, now felt like a target. Thus, the final tragedy began to unfold, not with open rebellion, but with the quiet stirrings of suspicion. The emperor's awareness had awakened, and with it came the knowledge that his life, already fragile, was slipping into peril. The court sensed it too. In the whispers of the palace, the future was already being written, and it did not include the boy who sat upon the dragon throne. The whispers began quietly, like faint ripples across the still surface of a pond. At first, they were rumors of frail health, murmured among eunuchs and attendants. "The emperor is weak," they said. "Perhaps heaven does not intend for him to live long." Such words, though hushed, carried lethal weight within the palace walls. In the fragile politics of the Han court, the emperor's vitality was not simply a personal matter. It was the foundation upon which legitimacy rested. If Shang appeared sickly, even for a moment, it was interpreted as a cosmic sign, a signal that the mandate of heaven might be slipping. And for those who already wielded power in his name, his frailty became an opportunity. The Deng clan did not need Shang to live long. They needed him to live only so long as he remained useful. A child emperor had been the perfect screen for their authority. But now that he was a teenager, with awareness growing behind his eyes, he was less convenient. If he survived into manhood, he might challenge them. If he asserted himself, their hold on power could fracture. Thus, the whispers grew darker. Courtiers speculated in private that the empire might be better served with a younger child upon the throne. Someone still pliant, still incapable of questioning orders. The idea spread like smoke through corridors, never stated openly but carried in glances and veiled phrases. "Perhaps heaven calls for renewal," some muttered. Others nodded silently, understanding the meaning hidden beneath. For Shang, the rumors reached his ears like poison long before any cup was offered. He felt the weight of them pressing down upon him. Illness, real or fabricated, was now a weapon. A cough could be seized upon as a death sentence. A pale face could spark speculation of imminent demise. The emperor was no longer seen as a sovereign, but as a problem to be solved. The cruelty of it lay in its silence. No accusations were leveled, no warnings given. Instead, Shang lived in the knowledge that unseen forces were calculating his worth, measuring the length of his life against their ambitions. Each day he awoke, wondering if it would be his last as emperor or his last at all. History records these years with cold brevity, but one can imagine the tension in the boy's heart. He was only 17, an age when most young men dream of freedom, of love, of futures unwritten. Instead, he lived under the constant shadow of suspicion, with no ally to trust and no refuge to flee to. His crown had become not only a burden, but a sentence. The whispers hardened into expectation. Shang's death was no longer a question of if, but of when. And the palace, ever efficient in disguising cruelty with ceremony, began to prepare. It happened in silence, as all true acts of palace cruelty do. There was no trial, no council, no formal decree, only a cup offered in the name of medicine. Shang had been reported ill, though whether the illness was real or invented, history does not say. What is certain is that in the year 106 CE, at the age of 17, the young emperor was handed a draft said to restore his health. Perhaps it came from a trusted physician. Perhaps it was delivered by an attendant whose face betrayed nothing. The palace left no record of the hand that held it, only of the boy who drank. The liquid was bitter. He may have felt it burn down his throat, its chill spreading through his body. Within moments, the truth revealed itself. His limbs weakened, his chest grew heavy. The palace blurred around him, its golden walls dissolving into darkness. And as attendants stood by, silent and watchful, the Son of Heaven collapsed. There were no cries, no desperate attempts to revive him. Those who witnessed understood what had been done and why. To resist would be to challenge the Deng clan, to place one's own life in peril. And so the court held its breath as the emperor's life ebbed away, as if death itself were another ritual in the endless pageantry of power. For Shang, the tragedy was not only in the moment of his death, but in the life denied to him. He had never ruled. He had never tasted the freedom of choice. His entire existence had been orchestrated, first as a symbol, then as an obstacle, and finally as a casualty. Even his death was scripted by others. 17 years old. Too young to have shaped his empire, yet old enough to understand the betrayal. The crown that had been placed upon his head as an infant had become a poisoned chalice, and it was with poison that his reign ended. Outside the palace, the empire scarcely paused. Officials drafted edicts to announce his passing with solemn words that concealed the truth. Another boy would soon be chosen, another puppet for the regents to manipulate. The machinery of governance ground forward, indifferent to the life just extinguished. But within those final moments, Shang's story crystallized into something more than politics. He was a boy emperor who lived and died without ever being allowed to become himself. His silence was enforced in life and ensured in death. The poison did not simply kill his body, it erased his voice from the history he should have shaped. Thus ended the brief reign of Emperor Shang of Han, not with rebellion, not with glory, but with a quiet cup and a silence that echoed louder than any cry. The death of Emperor Shang was not met with mourning that shook the empire, nor with monuments that proclaimed the tragedy of a young life cut short. Instead, it was quietly folded into the machinery of governance, a moment of transition rather than loss. The court moved swiftly. Announcements were drafted with solemn phrasing, presenting the emperor's passing as a natural event, an act of heaven's will rather than the hand of man. To the people, he was remembered as a fragile youth whose brief reign had been destined to end early. The truth that his life was deliberately taken was buried beneath the weight of ritual words. No grand funeral marked his departure. The ceremonies were carried out, of course, but with a muted efficiency that revealed the court's impatience to move forward. The body of a 17-year-old, once called the Son of Heaven, was laid to rest with the trappings of empire, but without the sincerity of grief. Ministers bowed, musicians played their dirges, but their hearts were already fixed on the next emperor, the next chapter of their own survival. For the Deng clan, Shang's death was not a tragedy, but a solution. His absence cleared the path for another child emperor, one who could again serve as the perfect vessel for their control. And so, within days, the throne was filled. Continuity was restored. The empire was assured that all was as it should be. But what of Shang himself? His name slipped from the tongues of courtiers almost as soon as it had been spoken in eulogies. The chronicles, when they came to record his reign, did so with chilling brevity. A boy who ruled in name for 1 year, then died young. His life, so consumed by silence, was given the same treatment in death. Imagine the loneliness of that oblivion. To live without freedom, and then to die without remembrance. The palace, with its golden roofs and crimson walls, became his coffin long before his burial. His crown, meant to immortalize him, became the very weight that erased him. History is often merciless to the powerless. Where emperors of might and conquest are given chapters, Shang is given a few lines. Where others are remembered for decrees and wars, he is remembered only for his fragility. His death was not a rupture in the empire, but a quiet substitution, as seamless as the replacement of one mask with another. And yet, in that silence lies the harshest truth. The empire that called him Son of Heaven cared nothing for the boy who bore the title. He was a placeholder, and once he was gone, the world moved on without hesitation. His death was not simply forgotten, it was erased. The story of Emperor Shang of Han is not the tale of a ruler who failed, but of a throne that devoured the child who sat upon it. His life, from beginning to end, was defined by forces greater than himself: ambition, power, and fear. He was born into privilege, yet he lived in captivity. He was crowned with authority, yet stripped of agency. He bore the title of Son of Heaven, yet he never once felt the freedom of being his own master. And at the fragile age of 17, he was poisoned not because of what he had done, but because of what he might have done. In Shang's story, the fragility of the imperial system is revealed. The emperor was supposed to be the axis of the world, yet he was utterly dependent on those around him. The throne promised absolute power, yet in practice it could render its occupant the weakest figure in the empire. His tragedy was not personal alone, it was structural. It exposed the paradox at the heart of monarchy, that supreme authority often rests upon the most fragile shoulders. His end also reminds us of the brutality of politics when stripped of morality. The Deng clan, celebrated by some historians for maintaining stability, did so at the cost of a young man's life. Their rule was efficient, but their efficiency was cruel. Shang was reduced to a pawn, then discarded when he ceased to serve. In that, his story echoes countless others across history. Lives extinguished not for their deeds, but for their inconvenient existence. And yet, there is something profoundly human in his silence. For though the chronicles remember him only briefly, the image of a boy emperor poisoned in his youth lingers in the imagination. He represents every individual crushed by the weight of systems too vast to resist. He is the reminder that behind every title, every crown, there is a beating heart, vulnerable and mortal. The silent end of Emperor Shang is thus more than a historical footnote. It is a warning. Power is never as secure as it seems, and those who appear strongest may in fact be the most powerless. Thrones promise glory, but they conceal danger. Crowns dazzle, but they weigh heavily. And sometimes, as with Shang, they kill. 17 years of life, 1 year of reign, and an eternity of silence. That is the legacy of Emperor Shang of Han, a boy who became emperor, an emperor who became a victim, and a victim who became a ghost within the annals of history.